slide. Has been to politics, not only looking at transformations through what we called tidy governance procedures that bring about change, but also how through political resistance and mobilization change can be brought about for greater justice. And we've been doing this through using the Environmental Justice Atlas, which many of you probably already know about. Leah Temper will be talking about this in more detail tomorrow. She'll be giving us a glimpse into how we've used the Atlas in the ACKnowl-EJ project as a research tool. But basically, the EJ Atlas is an online resource that has been compilating environmental conflicts throughout the whole world over the last 4 years, 5 years, nearly 5 years, and systematizing their dynamics, their strategies, and the outcomes of these conflicts. And is what the creators of this atlas, including Leah Temper and Joan Martínez-Arier, among others, talk about the conflicts as a reflection of a social metabolism of increasing environmental conflicts due to globalization and capitalism expansion throughout the whole world. And so we've been using the atlas to do some more statistical analysis to see what comes out of these struggles. Leah will talk a little bit about this later, and we've also been doing in-depth case studies in different parts of the world to take a look at how these changes take place and what are the resistance strategies that are used during mobilizations. And we'll be talking today about a case study in Bolivia and in Turkey, and more broadly about different trends in the project. And we'll have four short presentations. Our idea with this session is to share with you what we call some methodological tools that we've been developing in ACKnowl-EJ to analyze with communities and for communities how transformations take place as a result of mobilization. So we're not going to be talking necessarily about findings. We want to focus more on how we are conceiving this idea of co-production as a research process, and some of the methods we've used to analyze together with the communities that are facing resistance, that are going through resistance activities or mobilizations to try to bring about just transformations. And so first of all, Mariana Walter will be talking to us a little bit about how we conceived and understood co-production in the project. Leah Temper will be showing us how the Atlas has been used as a methodological tool, and it is an interactive tool with the people that are forming part of conflicts. So in itself, it is a co-produced tool and for systematizing and research. Then I will be sharing with you a framework that we've developed in the project called the Conflict Transformation Framework, which puts a focus on power analysis and power strategies to bring about change. And Begum, our friend Begum from Turkey, will be talking about the use of scenario analysis in analyzing transformations. So Mariana, do you want to all come here? Or? Maybe one by one.
Thank you, Iokine. So, as Iokine was mentioning, the ACKnowl-EJ project, academic and activist co-production of knowledge for environmental justice. So we understand that as researchers that we work with communities, we are co-producing with communities. We are learning from them, we are sharing and learning. It's a bi-directional process. So I think this is a first important thing to highlight. We don't see ourselves as external going, but trying to really engage with communities. And the second dimension of our work in the ACKnowl-EJ is that the type of interaction and co-production we do is for something. It's for environmental justice. It's not just the understanding of this co-learning, co-production, co-creation. There's all these terms now around that can be used. We don't have a specific law with co-production. There's many terms around. But this idea of doing for something. And in this project, we have worked with communities discussing with them, deciding how the research will be developed with them, and going through an assessment of their transformations that was born for conflict or that was born from alternatives, trying to understand how they are happening, what worked and what didn't, and what could be improved. So I think it's interesting to highlight this effort to co-produce with communities with a certain aim, shared aim of environmental justice. And during the whole project and the different meetings we had what we called process documentation process, where what we did is reflexively did this co-production process in a reflexive way, discussing among us and with communities what were the challenges. And as researchers, you have your own commitments to publish and to go to conference, and communities that have their own aims and their ethical concerns as well. So which are not always so coherent, and of course there's tension. So we did this exercise to document and discuss among ourselves about how co-production was developed, where were the challenges and the lessons that we are trying to systematize now. So I think this is something to share, and maybe you can also share your own experiences on how to co-produce in a reflexive way. And so I just wanted to mention this, and maybe in the discussion we can expand on these ideas. So now Leah will, I don't know, those of you in the EJ Atlas session, so we will talk again about EJ Atlas, but Leah will focus more on the work done on different work done on the Atlas, and how you can see the Atlas as a co-production process as well.
So I'm going to talk. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one approach we've taken to drawing from the EJ Atlas data and understanding it. And we have been referring to it as a comparative statistical political ecology. For those of you who are in the last session, there was this, someone commented, you open up the Atlas page and all you see is so many dots, and it becomes really overwhelming. And then you click on a dot and you go into the story, so you can, and that has actually been the standard approach in political ecology, is really this fine-grained approach, really getting into the textures and the context of the communities and the struggles, the histories, the dynamics. So the Atlas, of course, is kind of taking, in some ways, it opens up the possibility for this other approach, which is really looking at these macro factors across different scales. And there's really a lot of challenges to doing this type of analysis. How do you do this sort of macro analysis without losing the texture and the voices of the communities and the histories? So I think this is one of the things we've been kind of approaching and trying to do. And I'm going to present just one methodology that I've been using here for how I've been trying to approach to study the Atlas in a statistical way, some of the challenges to doing this, how I've overcome it, and then kind of end with a few open questions and future research possibilities. So as it's been mentioned before, the Atlas was created as this sort of hybrid activist research tool where the information is, struggles that come from the frontline communities. And the way it worked in the EJOL project was that we had organizations who were kind of intermediaries. They had been working with these frontline communities for many years and had amassed this really store of information of 20 to 30 years of work as environmental justice organizations. And the EJ Atlas aimed to collect all of this data into one place. A lot of these databases existed along thematic lines or regional lines. And with this process of standardization, there's obviously some loss in some way of this place-based details of the struggles, this process of systematization. And I think it's something that, it's a critique that can also be made of like, oh, is this an extractive process in a sense that you're trying to extract and record these stories and histories of struggle within one online standardized database where everything needs to be checked off on a box and inputted into a form. So I think there's, potential, for example, to open up these sort of critiques and to discuss them. Is it worth it to do this sort of endeavor? Is it counterproductive? And what I was interested to study in this paper, I'm going to be, in this work more broadly, I'm going to be presenting some of the outputs of this process tomorrow, so I won't give you really results now. But just to say is, if we want to understand, for example, the outcomes of ecological conflicts, it's quite complicated. And here's one case that I was following for many years in India. It's the case of the Dongria Khond, who were defending their sacred mountain against mining by a British company with an Hindu name, Vedanta. And you can see here a little bit of the twists and turns in how different cases, Juan Liu was talking about, can we really say a case is a success or not? And so for this analysis, I don't like to use, there is a question in the atlas, is this case, do you consider it a success or not? I don't use that because it's very subjective, but it is interesting to look at what are the different types of outcomes that have emerged from the cases. So you can see in this one, it was a landmark victory. So this morning you heard about the Forest Rights Act. This was one of the first cases where the Forest Rights Act was actually enforced. Then we see the Forest Rights Act is being cut down to size. The government rejects the plans, and then just about 2 months ago, we see activists have been arrested, 2 died in clashes outside the refinery, and Vedanta is expanding the plant to 6 million tons, even though they don't have the mine. And this has just happened in the last 2 months, and this case is known as a landmark victory case. So you can understand that it really complicates how we analyze the outcomes of these cases. So these are just so you get an idea of the outcomes. And so what I have been doing actually then is creating sort of markers for understanding the cases. And what I was particularly interested in is 2 types of markers. Markers that show different types of success of the cases. So there's some sort of partial success where the movement achieves some of its aims, referred to as partial success, and then a more complete success. We know there isn't such a thing as complete success, but kind of a more full success where the movement achieves its primary aim or most of its aims. For example, in the case of Niamjiri, the aim was to stop the mine from happening, and that was achieved. And the other outcomes that I'm interested to look at is different types of repression, which is activists being killed, murdered, and arrested and criminalized. And by creating these different groups of cases, so I'm really interested looking at 4 groups of cases where there's clear success, cases where there's partial success, cases where there's repression, and cases where you have both repression and clear success. And what I did was ran a statistical regression looking at different variables and how they kind of appear differently in these 4 groups. For those cases that have no positive outcomes nor any repressive outcomes, that becomes the reference group. So I'm comparing these 4 groups with that group. And so I actually show you the results because we don't have much time. I just want to give you an example of how you can approach this sort of large-scale analysis. And just a few notes, what I think the value of this approach is. So, you know, this, I think it's novel because political ecology, as I mentioned, relies on the case study. But how from there do we move from the case study to really being able to understand the broader trends, to make generalizable statements, to understand the dynamics that are really happening? And this is a weakness of political ecology and of environmental justice studies as well. So the Atlas opens up this potential for understanding these broader dynamics, and it really offers the possibility. It doesn't only allow you to do this sort of large N analysis, where, you know, everything is just reduced to a number or statistic. What I really like about this type of analysis is I can run a filter and go back to any of the cases and really go back into those fine-grained details. And if the questions I want to look at are not in the Atlas, then I just, you know, look up in the political ecology literature to see if there's a case study or other information about it. So you really have this potential to weave in and out of the data and analyze across different regional scales and sectoral scales, so on and so forth. You know, the point of making these trends is also to be able to kind of come up with recipes for action or for policy recommendations based on the results. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in cross-sectoral comparisons, biophysical distinctions, looking at commodity cycles, so on and so forth. And I think this is the part that you know, we need to dive back into now, is how do we find research questions that really do support the needs of these communities? And what sort of results can bolster communities? So I think that has to be a key question always in our mind in terms of engaged research. We can examine or discuss the possibilities for different textual analysis, but it might have some constraints. We're actually looking at that now because we're analyzing transformative cases in the Atlas, which is a whole other kettle of fish. If we want to talk about that in the discussion, we can. And yeah, and then I just want to bring up this question of, you know, what do we lose out, or what are the drawbacks of doing analysis at this scale? So I hope I didn't speak too long, and I'll pass it on. Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a taster into how we moved from the big database of the EJ Atlas to more focalized case studies. And I'm going to be sharing both a little bit of a framework that we have developed as part of a Latin American network that I form part of called Grupo Confluencias, and we've been working for a long time on how do we evaluate conflict transformation? How can we say that a conflict has been transformed towards greater justice? And this is a big question because a lot of people talk about conflict management, conflict transformation, but what are the differences between both? And we've been struggling with this, so we've tried to develop this framework that helps us try to pin down what exactly conflict transformation might look like. And this paper I've developed it particularly with my colleague Mirna Inturias from Bolivia, who was key in developing this case study in Bolivia, which I want to talk to you about. We put a focus on power analysis in this framework, and you'll see why. So mainly what we're trying to see, our point of departure with this framework is that conflicts are transformed as long as we change power relations, the power relations that are creating inequities, and we need to address those as the power asymmetries that are transversal to conflicts, to say that we are evolving from a situation of oppression, exclusion, to a situation of greater justice. And using the theories from political sciences, we've drawn on this difference between hegemonic power in these three categories: structural power vested in institutions, in economic frameworks, and political frameworks. People vested in, power relations vested in peoples and their networks, sort of elite alliances that reproduce particular ways of knowing the world or interests. And the third dimension of power, which is cultural value, which is vested in discourses, the more Foucault, again, the word, the more sort of invisible way of power, which is vested in narratives and worldviews that is more transmitted without people necessarily being aware of it. And we propose that conflicts are transformed in as far as communities can engage or do engage with the different dimensions of power, the different asymmetries expressed in these different forms of power in conflicts. So what we try to capture is what are the strategies that communities are putting into place to produce a change in those three different types of power. So how are communities developing strategies to produce changes in institutions, in legal frameworks, in economic frameworks, in political frameworks? How are communities creating new alliances with other actors that can help them counterbalance dominant networks that are reproducing particular views and interests? And how are communities creating new discourses and new values that can actually counterbalance the dominant values during their struggles? And so one of the things that we put a focus on when we're doing our case studies is in analyzing those strategies. And the second one is, okay, so what comes out of those strategies? What are the changes that are produced when people display different strategies that are trying to impact on those different types of power? And we've developed these indicators that from our perspective, when we talk about conflict transformation, we're talking about developing strategies that can actually help those actors that are in a more vulnerable situation in conflicts to strengthen their power. And what we've noticed as key elements in this process of transformation is strengthening their cultural vitality of communities. So if as a result of those strategies, the community's cultural values, their diversities, and their recognition is being strengthened, that's one thing that we see as a positive transformation. The other one is the political agency of communities has actually become stronger as a result of those strategies. If the local means of production have come more under the control of communities, if there are new diversified ways of economic production that give more control at the local level, if the local institution and governance structures have been strengthened, and if there's any evidence of greater environmental integrity as a result of the struggle. So these are the 5 sort of indicators that we try to use to see if as a result of the strategies there has been some sign of the conflict moving towards a positive transformation. So this is a summary of the type of strategies that movements use to try to impact on what we call structural power. So communities generally use resistance, mobilization, advocacy, lobbying, creating new political institutions, participating in existing institutions, strengthening their own customary institutions, or creating new modes of production. Those are strategies that we say tend to try to produce a change in the structural dimension of power. Strategies that they generally use to produce a change in dominant networks and elite networks are strategies like strengthening the local organization, developing a greater understanding of conflict and resistance strategies, sensitizing decision-making actors, working with them, disseminating new knowledge. Other strategies that have to do more with impacting the cultural hegemony have to do with reconstructing local histories, reconstructing local knowledges, developing local management plan, and constructing views of the future. These have to do more with impacting on that more invisible dimension of power. And we say that strengthening these pillars are what we hope or we think can take us closer to increasing justice and reducing violence in conflicts. I won't go into this, but we have developed very, very detailed guiding questions to see if each of those indicators are actually moving in the direction that we think in terms of strengthening those 5 pillars. This information is all available in the ACKnowl-EJ webpage in the framework that you can consult if you want to go into greater detail. Just to give you a very quick glimpse of how we've used this in Bolivia. So this is a case study that we worked with. It's called Lomerío in the lowlands of Bolivia. And you probably all know that, many of you probably aware that Bolivia has undergone a huge political transformation over the last sort of decade. And one of them is, the main one is this new form of nation state, which is based on plurinational values, where indigenous rights and our political autonomy is central to the achievement to this model. How far this has happened, I won't go into detail. How truly plural the model is, we could discuss later. So this is the case study of Lomerío. Oh, sorry, forgot to mention, one of the key things that has happened as a result of this process is a very, very widespread land redistribution process, whereby indigenous communities are being given property over their lands. And Lomerío is one of them. Lomerío obtained in 2006 a land title over 260,000 hectares, and they're now managing their territory through their own institutions and governance systems. And I have been working in Lomerío since 2013, and the ACKnowl-EJ project came to feed into a process that we had already started. And when we approached them to try to ask them if they were interested in us helping them systematize their history of struggle to control their territories, they proposed us that we actually develop the research that would not only help us answer that question just on its own, it would actually help them to answer a bigger concern that they have, which was the loss of knowledge and political leadership of the younger generations over the management of their lands, because they see that even though they are owners of their territories, they feel that they are actually losing control over their lands, and you'll see why. So they asked us if we could develop a research process that was co-produced, but also had an impact on capacity building and bringing together older leaders and older generations with younger generations to debate about what is happening to them, starting with a module that would focus on the history of Lomerío and where they come from, and I can go into more detail about that later. Then there was a second module where we would apply this conflict transformation framework to see how they have been developing the resistance strategies to gain control over the land over the last 40 years, and what has come out of that transformation, on a module that would help them discuss and debate about what are the indigenous leadership values that are more important to have control over your territories. They wanted to have an opportunity to share their experiences over public administration of common lands and what autonomy means. And then the fifth module would be the challenges they would have in the future if and when they gain political rights over their territories. And this is a process that we carried out throughout a year on a rotational basis between different communities. And the community that we did for the second module, which is where we applied the framework, involved leaders from the 24 villages. 2 or 3 came from each village, and we spent 2.5 days applying this framework. And they chose to work with what they call their platforms of struggle, which they have developed very strategically to focus on strategies to help them gain control over their lands. And some of them, which are not, all of them are here, but one of them is community forestry. They have developed a community forestry management plans in all the villages. They have developed a territorial control platform to gain control over the land, indigenous autonomy, gender, health, different platforms. So we applied this framework for each one of these platforms of struggle, trying to see what strategies they have developed over the last 40 years to achieve their objectives in strengthening those platforms of struggle in this different categories. So we analyze, okay, what have you done to impact on the structural power? Of course, we spent first a half day explaining what these different types of power mean and how they express and how they experience them in a non-academic way. And then we spend the rest of the workshop going through the different strategies that they have developed. So for instance, in the case of the community forestry, they started all working in groups, drawing conclusions on what are the different strategies that they have developed to gain control over the forest through the community forestry. Things like changing the legislation, for the forestry legislation, developing, expulsing timber companies from the territories, developing new strategies for forestry, lobbying for changes in the legislation, and developing forestry management plans, and creating a range of alliances with different actors that could help them develop those strategies. And recently they have started thinking about adding value to their knowledge about forestry as something that they can capitalize on, and providing services to people outside their territories on how to do forestry. And in terms of territorial rights, also things like political mobilization, participating in marches, participating in the constitutional reforms, are all strategic activities that were aimed very clearly at producing structural change. There were other, of course, strategies that were more focused on building alliances. As you see here, nothing on culture, which I'll explain why later. I don't want to go into the great detail, but we've done the same analyzing. We did the same analyzing all the platforms of struggle. What comes out of this analysis, we didn't really get the 5 pillars and analyze with them the pillars. What we asked was, so what have you gained and what have you lost after all this process of strategizing at different levels? And it's very interesting because when they say what we have gained, they have gained a huge amount of things if you put them in relation to their pillars. So they feel that in terms of their own new networks, they feel they have increased their feeling of freedom, living well. They have new trained human resources. They feel they're planning their own development. They have more ownership of the forests. They have new forest management plans. Feel they have more food security. And their organization has been strengthened. They have impacted hugely in changes in legislations at different levels. Feel they have more security over their land. Have new experiences in public administration. So amazing achievements, but also a huge amount of concerns about losses that these gains come with and come along losses and challenges. And one of the biggest one has to do with this, the pillar of cultural vitality. As you have seen from the strategies, they have been focusing a lot historically on impacting on structural change and creating new networks, but they haven't been working as much on strengthening their cultural vitality and revitalization, which puts them into great risk because it means that the younger generations, as you saw from the beginning of the presentation, are less and less in a way attached to their land, have less knowledge about their history and their relationship with the territory. They also feel that their political agency, despite the fact that it has been strengthened in some ways, it has actually become weaker because the political relations between different fractions in the territory are fragile and not stable. And the most concerning one is that they actually feel that they are, despite the fact that they're owners of their land or the forest, they're also starting to lose control over their land. So just to finish, doing this framework with them was hugely beneficial in terms of, okay, just stopping for a moment and analyzing what have we done, but what challenges do we still have ahead? How have we been able to do all this, but what do we still have to really work on to ensure that in the long term we will have local control over our territories. And the things that come out from the analysis that they still have to be really focusing on is, of course, trying to succeed in the claim for political autonomy, which they've been doing greatly and very well over the last years, but it's been slow. Their concerns are about diversifying the productive systems, but working a lot on this cultural dimension and on reconstructing their language, their knowledges, strengthening their history, developing long-term life plans, and also continuing this work with the strengthening of their own leaderships and internal fractions, not only looking for alliances outside, but how to really reconstruct their own different alliances within the territory. So this is just to give you a very, very quick glance of how you can use this tool at a community case study and what it can bring about for their own people involved in struggles.
While Begum is setting up. Oh, I just wanted to make one other comment. So in ACKnowl-EJ, we work a lot with we have the two sides of ACKnowl-EJ. One side is the conflict, and the other side is the alternative movements, which, we kind of look at the overlap between them when alternatives emerge from these more contentious movements, how alternative movements emerge through, you know, opposing different processes of oppression. So we've been working with two frameworks. One is the one that Iokine presented, and there's another one that has been developed by our partner in India, Kalpavriksh, that is, we call it the alternatives framework. And it's also used with communities to deepen the holistic approach of their alternatives. And it follows a little bit in what David Schlossberg was talking about this morning. You have, you know, movements, in our case, they're mostly south-based movements, but you know, they're kind of engaged in these alternative processes, but how holistic are they? You know, what sort of spheres are they touching on? Do they integrate social justice concerns? Are they integrating economic democracy? What is their understanding of sustainability, so on and so forth? So that tool can also be used by communities to deepen their own processes of transformations. And both of these tools have been used throughout the project with different communities. So, and that the India one emerged from a process called Vikalp Sangam, which is a confluence alternatives where different alternative movements from India gather to discuss different thematic and regional issues. And this framework emerged out of that process from the ground up. So if you want to see it, you can find it on the ACKnowl-EJ page and on the Vikalp Sangam page, I believe, as well.
Thank you, Iokine, for the session, for coordinating session. What I will present is a bit like the idea of working with scenarios and visions in order to prepare the ground for transformative politics within communities. And so the idea of the session is to check how academics can work for and with communities towards understanding just transformations. And so here, as part of the ACKnowl-EJ project, we have been working with a case study back in Turkey in an industrial zone with conflict for 40 years. So there is like kind of active movement trying to stop different investments, energy-related investment, industrial and waste-related problems. And as we wanted to engage with the community, at the beginning we didn't know, and with activists, so it was more like this idea of co-production. And so as academics, we were going to the field, and they were there, the activists working in this conflictual site for a very long time. And so we decided to use scenario building, collaborative scenario building methodology in order to engage with the problem at hand, and also to try a bit, challenge the conventional thinking and encourage debate at the local level. And because the situation, if you think of the Turkey's state of emergency and authoritarian past for the last at least now 15 years or 10-15 years, the environment when we went there was quite pessimistic at the local level. So what I would like to present here is not the case study per se. I just thought I wouldn't have enough time, but rather to give you a brief idea about the way scenarios could be worked with transformative politics. Oh. Yes, so the idea is to think about the future in a structured manner, and I like this way of presenting scenarios, in the sense that you have this more engineering way of looking at things, where you have this idea of integrated assessment. But I think with scenarios, you can more or less refer to the same things, where you have these like themes of concern, sectors, and then different scales, local, regional, global. And then you have also the idea of, you know, resilience, sustainability, equity, and then also all these sustainability dimensions, social, economy, and environment. But more importantly, you have the idea of, as Iokine was referring, the idea of local agency and actors that are involved in all these spheres. So I think there are many definitions of scenarios. There is a very well-established scenario literature. Scenarios are used as planning tools for 50 years. But I think the way now we can use them for transformative politics maybe could be a bit more novel. So here, maybe the easiest definition that we might use is the GEO3 definition that was adopted by UNEP, descriptions of journeys to possible futures. So scenarios are somehow reflecting different assumptions about how current trends will unfold, how critical uncertainties will play out, and what new factors will come into play. So the idea is not to predict or forecast. It's more like an idea for, like an exercise for learning and reflexivity. And so here, of course, there are different scenario methodologies as well. There are ways of looking backward or looking forward. So you could just ask what if or how could, you know, and focus on the outcome of events and take the image of the futures, or look at the maybe from a backward induction perspective, how could, with critical path. And of course, in the literature, again, there are so many established scenario studies at different levels, but these global scenarios, for instance, from 2002, is well known, and you have these three main classes, conventional worlds, barbarization, great transitions, with different visions in each class. And so when looking at 2002, maybe the idea of fortress world, for instance, was more difficult to imagine, but being here now in 2019, I think we are going towards this fortress world. And so the way I would like to somehow relate the scenario building is what Flyberg calls this social, and in social sciences, phronetic research. So the you have these four-value rational questions, which could be very easily be related with this idea of scenario building. Where are we going? Who gains and who loses by which mechanisms of power? Is this development desirable? And what, if anything, should we do about it? So the idea for us in this case study, and we are still working with it, now we have our own local scenarios for the local site, is somehow to give answers to these questions with the local community. And I have been just inspired by the last ACKnowl-EJ session, and maybe this could be also seen as post-conflict scenarios and the generation of alternative visions somehow. And of course, why are we working with multiple scenarios? The idea is somehow to compare maybe the desirable future with the alternatives and somehow assess all the strategies and a bit stimulate reflection in relation to the underlying assumptions, and a bit experimenting with the local community. And the idea of giving insights to the context and outcomes, sometimes these are intended, sometimes not. And then also somehow identify some tipping points, key decisions and indicators, and maybe leverage points. And I think that's what we would like to do also for this specific case study. How can we address blockages of transformation, to transformation? And so here I would just very briefly illustrate the way we are looking at scenario building. So in general, there are these key themes that we would like to focus, and of course some big questions in mind. And then we have our own boundaries, spatial and temporal. So for instance, for our own case study, we have as our time perspective 2030 and then 2050. So we have just these two time scales. And we are looking at the region within the Turkey's context somehow. And we have a historical context with a 40 years story from 1980s onwards. And then also we have some major issues of concern, some driving forces, some are given. There are these established trends, but then also these are part of critical, there are also some critical uncertainties. So we might somehow play in relation to these uncertainties. And then we have the somehow storylines towards the future, what changes. And I would like to relate with Iokine's power transformation framework. That's what we do for our case study. For instance, what changes? Are these institutions law as one dimension of power, people, alliances and networks, maybe technology, and then worldviews, values, beliefs, discourses mainly, right? And then we have these images of the future. We already have the storylines, like our images of the future for our own case study site. And so the idea is we have the conflict in this current context, and then we would like to make an analysis for change. And the idea is to somehow have this positive framing in the sense that so far the conflict or the resistance has always been trying to stop investments, coal power plants, industries, etc. But now what we are trying to do is to focus a bit on what we want to achieve, and also try to discuss a bit the process of envisioning. If we want to change, maybe the idea could be to communicate what is the shared vision, and a bit painting, as today they have been brilliantly doing, painting the future that is desirable for the broader public. And of course, I think one of the ideas is to look at this inter-scale interaction, in the sense that, of course, there are multiple forces operating at this regional scale, and sometimes you have these structural influences that are so powerful that they are like a kind of constraint on transformation at the local level. But then somehow we have to look at the room for maneuver and focus on the local agency, as Iokine in their own case study were doing. And so local actors, of course, are doing something about what's going on at the broader level, at the national, at the global level. So these structural influences somehow are resisted sometimes, or you have some alliances that adapt to it, and sometimes there are these bargains. And what actually maybe is happening is more like a kind of dialectic between the local agency and the structural influences. And we would like to play around this local agency at our own local level. And so, in a way, yes, we have our own conflict analysis, so that's the problem at hand today. And then we know that there are all these structural influences at the national level, at the global level, but then we are also trying to understand a bit the local factors, and we are trying to see the level of local agency, and that's where maybe the power analysis starts. And then we would really look at this transformative politics and try to analyze how can change occur. And this idea of, reacting a bit to what is happening at the larger scale. You have these larger scale scenarios, of course, but then maybe there would also be somehow room for maneuver at the local level. And of course, also we are a bit evaluating the local agency, and this is very much in line with what Iokine has shown. We are trying to understand the capacity at the local level and the ways in which this could be enhanced. And then also a bit have this, mapping where we have, of course, somehow larger scale scenarios and local scale scenarios. And depending on the level of local agency, whether it's low or high, then maybe as long as local agency is high, there will be more tensions, resistance, and alliances, which could define alternative developments, which are somehow not so consistent with what's happening at the larger scale. But if the local agency is low, maybe large-scale scenarios, what's happening at the national level, will be decisive. So they will be the boundary conditions. So in a way, that's still some work we are trying to do. But the idea is to work with this local community and then come up with a strategic plan with these scenarios and try to have these in this last, like for the 5-10 years plan as part of their local action. Thank you.
Basically wanted just to open the floor for comments, conversation really, if you have yourselves experiences using similar or different methods, tools for analyzing transformation with communities that are undergoing environmental struggles. We would love to hear about them. Also, if you have any questions or need clarifications, we're happy to do that as well. But we basically wanted to have a conversation, if possible, with the information that we've shared with you. So.
Yeah, it could also be reflections on your own approach to engaged research, or different approaches to doing environmental justice research with communities. So.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Leah Temper. I'm connected to an institute that calls itself Transformative Sustainability Research Institute and does sustainability science, and they're very strong in defining this new academic field of sustainability science, and it's basically a lot of younger white men defining the four corners of this universe. And it's been extremely difficult to get environmental justice heard in any way there. So it's not just that they are not interested, they're actively rejecting it. They're actively against including environmental justice. And what I've noticed is what's happening in that field is that they're taking on the word justice and defining it in their own way. A lot of what David said this morning and the materialist movements reminded me a lot of that idea of justice, where equity and gender justice and all this just falls under the table, especially race, equity, decolonial perspectives. And I was sitting here imagining what they would say now, which is, well, we've got this cover, it's a narrow technique, we developed it, we were doing all of this. So first of all, it's amazing to hear you speak, because it's really a relief to be in this kind of space again. But also, what would you say are the most important differences of the way you do transformative research, transformative sustainability-oriented research to the classical, or well, the white male-dominated sustainability science, the conventional ways of doing sustainability here in the global north? And your presentation, it came out really well, I think. It was really clear with the outcome indicators that there's a whole different idea of what makes it a success. In the centenary technique, I'd be really interested in if you could summarize a little bit, what is the difference in environmental justice-focused scenario techniques, and maybe with all of you, like what are the most important differences that you would name and that you would claim as really important to make just sustainability happen instead of just sustainability. You know, capital J, small j. So.
Well, I think one my own first ideas, and I think my friends and colleagues will complement this. I think we really have capitalized on this idea that's not ours. It's actually from the STEP Center, among others, in Sussex. This idea that we are engaging with the unruly politics. So the idea that it is through resistance and political action that change can and needs to happen. It's not about controlled processes of governing change. It's not about setting up nicely, tightly organized rules and negotiations and governance procedures, institutional arrangements that transformative change happens. The other one is that we are engaging with power as an issue of, we're acknowledging the role that asymmetries of power have in conflicts. And the other thing is that we are actually talking about transformations through conflict. So we actually look at this gradient between conflict towards alternatives. This is a very, and I think it's very important that Leah made this clarification after my presentation, is that we are not only focusing on the idea of conflict and resistance and unruly politics, but we think that alternatives happen as a result of conflicts, trying to engage with those power asymmetries that are creating injustice and exclusion. So for us, engaging with just injustice is the core of what is pushing transformative change. It's not something that we're looking to achieve just as a result of a governance procedures that we're doing, is we are actually trying to produce a process that is just, and not us, but we're paying attention of how movements are through the resistance to trying to create justice and engage with power. I think that's mainly.
There's a paper we published in Sustainability Science discussing some of this. We refer to radical transformations, not just transformations, but radical, meaning in multiple dimensions. And in this paper, we propose a framework to address transformations. But I think this idea of radical maybe it's a good point to make, no? Just not any, but just multidimensional and really with a more complex understanding of what sustainability is.
In our particular case, for instance, the conflict is not only about the environmental condition, it's more also about, you know, all these environmental justice claims where you have the idea of recognition and participation. And so in a green economy setting, if we had, you know, this ideal green economy, they would still have these claims, at least the local resistance. And one important outcome of the exercise we had with the local community in relation to this scenario building, they have really seen their role back in a positive manner, in the sense that they really thought that now that they are there is this business as usual, which is still not the worst case scenario, because there was, I mean, if they, because they are still doing a lot of good things, although they cannot stop many of the projects, they are still very important local agents, in the sense that if they were not there, a worst case scenario could occur. So then they re-established their own somehow role at the local level. Of course, I mean, the idea of going towards the ideal or a better scenario for them is still not so feasible, but I mean, that was very important. It was more like a kind of enlightenment for them.
So I'm going to talk, I think some of the stuff I'm going to touch on tomorrow in my talk, but just to say that I also came from a transitions conference last week, and yeah, a lot of my talk tomorrow was kind of spawned by that experience at the conference and seeing this complete lacuna of any discussion of activism and justice. And I mean, yeah, I'm at this conference saying, yeah, who are the actors that are responsible for social transformation, that are actually doing the social transformation, and they're not present here at this conference at all. So it's a bit strange. And I mean, some of the things, for example, there was some sessions and they're just saying, well, we're trying to come to common values, like, well, we're all in favor of a better life for all and flourishing for all. I'm like, I don't know about that, because, you know, what does that mean? Like, can we really have a better life for all if that's the language we're using? That's just going to kind of makes it seem like the current system is okay. And I mean, I think that so power is mentioned now more in the transitions framework. I think it's more lip service. So they say, yes, we're talking about power. Conflict, maybe less so. Contention, less so. And certainly really not getting into this thing about how we dismantle existing systems. So as you mentioned, it's kind of like there's these consensual movements, these niches, these innovation movements, and if we just kind of, all, change our consumption habits and have e-vehicles, then maybe we'll move to this new vision of sustainability. So I think, it's extremely, that vision that you're talking about is extremely exclusionary. Western as well, which I think is, I mean, we, like in ACKnowl-EJ project, we have case studies from 7 or 8 different countries, so trying to understand community perspectives from those countries. That's another one of the differences in approach. And I think this kind of, deeper understanding also of how, like, we also think through this question of oppositional consciousness. How do we begin to develop this consciousness that the system is not working and become committed to change it? So how does that process happen in different communities, both those that are working on alternatives and those that are part of contentious movements? So I think that's kind of a key feature.
Thank you. I'm Hilda Ibsen from Karlstad University in Sweden, and I'm a newcomer into this co-production of knowledge things. Just been working within that paradigm for a couple of years. After having inspiration from the Connected Communities, a project set up by the University of Bristol and also the Art and Humanities Research Council here in England. And I've been so inspired by you today, and particularly I love this academic activist co-produced knowledge. I work with a colleague at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. I'm talking about this on Thursday. And we are discussing a lot because we work in a vulnerable community south of Cape Town. And we call ourselves messy researchers. We talk about disruptive thinking. We have had workshops. And in the end, it's so much about ethics, it's about responsible research, and we work with people like you do. It's not researching people, it's just how to co-create with vulnerable people in different communities. So what I would like to hear from you, if you can say something about your experiences with giving feedback. I mean, we just come in, for us coming in as 2 white middle-aged women into a historically colored community, and we can just go on and discuss this for hours, because it's not like you just come in and you do something. And then at the end of the day, it's also about giving feedback and how to involve people in a real sense, not just saying it, but also doing it. So I would like you to say something about that, your experiences. Thank you.
Can you just clarify a bit, when you say giving feedback, do you mean how you bring the research back to the community?
our own experience is very much based on, first of all, trust building. I mean, we have chosen, when we had to choose like a kind of study site, as part of the project, we had some alternatives and ideas. But then, since this project was really requiring to work with the community, and that is within a short period of time, 3 years, so we decided to go for a context where we already have some connections. And so that was very, very important. I don't think you can just have, you know, a first initial relation and then start working. At least maybe this requires longer periods of collaboration. So we really know the activists through a colleague we have been working with, Ethem Can Turan. And so part of the movement is already very well connected to our own academic world, I would say. And so the trust was already there, and they were ready with collaborating with us. But there was this critical, somehow, balance between, getting in touch with other members of the resistance movements as well. So we really tried to engage them in an equal basis. And we also had a feedback session. How was their experience after 3 years? And we really want to keep the collaboration in the sense that now the project has ended. We have still a lot of things to do together. And so they said we could have, a problem in the sense that we might have externalities to them as well, but this was not the case. So it was a kind of relief. So it's a quite difficult, sensitive relationship, I think. And one of the problems they have now, they are also getting into other networks at larger scale, at more regional scale. And the synergies at local level are somehow weakening in the sense that what's happening at the regional level or national level becomes more attractive to some local members. And this could also be the case with this project in the sense that the ones getting to our university workshop or, so we really wanted to keep this balance, who is invited, who is not. All this can create issues and problems, and we were very careful with this. We tried to be at least very careful, and the feedback, at least for the time being, is that, this goes well. But this is not easy.
Just maybe to share, it's really a pity not to have here members from the group working in the ACKnowl-EJ from India, where they have very interesting case studies. And last year we had a meeting in India, and maybe it's interesting to share that the members of those communities working with the Kalpa Bridge, which is the name of the organization, came to our meeting in India, where we presented our case studies, and they were there. They presented with the research group from India their cases, and they heard the other cases, and it was actually really interesting because they made, and I think we were expecting them to be shy and not to speak. That was not the case. They made very interesting cases, and it was also amazing for them to see other international experiences that made them think about their own experiences. Other communities from India, for instance, there was a community in tension with nomadic communities, and then they heard another case about from the perspective of nomadic communities. So it was really rich, and I think that was a lesson for all of us, not to underestimate how communities can interact in these complex environments. Of course, we had some people from the Indian meeting translating, but the advantage is many Indian people speak English. So you have this possibility to make it easier for them to understand and participate. But just to mention this as a co-production experience, which I think was really interesting for us. And maybe to let Iokine say more about her.
Not very much, so that we can maybe give some opportunity to other people. But just one last thing. I think it's very interesting when we at least with the focus that we, as Begum was saying, we're not necessarily starting work in communities that we haven't worked with before. It's an ongoing relationship, and the term feedback is not necessarily the most appropriate, I would say, for our cases, because it's an ongoing relationship. It's an ongoing evaluation of what's coming out of the process, and it's actually feeding into new ideas and new activities that take shape as the process develops. So in our case, as you probably saw, this power analysis thing was only one part of a bigger process, and in fact, we've done that. We've finished all that, and now we're actually working on a different stage of collaboration, which has to do with strengthening their exchange between indigenous peoples in Bolivia on their autonomy processes. So it's like an ongoing evaluation, joint evaluation, and redefining of strategies and going on in terms of defining future work. So, Teresa, or maybe you want to have a go?
I have a very quick question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much. As other people have said, it's great to see you. It's great to hear that there are other people out there doing the work that you are. My question is about the scales. You've talked a lot about scale. At what scale are you looking and enhancing that transformation? At the individual, at the community level, at the regional, at the global? Where do you see those scales, but also where do you see yourselves in that transformation, and how you've changed in that process? Thank you.
Wow. Two big questions. Should we take a bunch of questions and then we'll do one last round?
Hi, my name's Cheryl. I'm an environmental justice researcher from Canada, and I was wondering if in your evaluative work or your transformative work with communities, whether or not you've been able to involve people in the communities as part of the research data collection teams, because we now have academic researcher grants in Canada that allow for the participants to receive financial compensation and to become part of the research team as a way to make the work, and not just transformative, but when you leave the community, then there is somebody who has been doing that bridge. So I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that, and like as others have said, to echo the sentiments that I really enjoyed hearing about the work that you were doing.
Yeah, my name is Siti Maimuna. I'm from Indonesia, but I'm studying in the University of Barcelona, German. I have a background activist in Indonesia, and sometimes I use the term of knowledge production things. But I wonder is because it's always have between researcher and whoever you work with is the asymmetry relation. So how you engage with this in the daily, because it's also a long-term project. So I really want to learn, because I think it's interesting to know the dynamic intersection things between, community and also the researcher. That's the first question. And the second question, what's your plan with the toolkits, whatever that you put on the website? Is it you want to, because usually all the resources become in website. But what your plan to kind of expand the collaboration or make exercise in the different step? Thank you.
I can start with some of the questions. I won't touch on all of them. Just about, so beyond what we have in the website, some of what's emerged from this project, and I want to talk about one other process that we've been working on, and it's about to be published as a paper. It's called the Tarot of Transgressive Research. And what we did along with some colleagues from this project and a sister project that works on transgressive learning is explore, and it comes back also to this question of personal transformation, explore our own roles as researchers. It's called and how we see ourselves. And in the paper, we use sort of like a tarot deck of different researchers to say, you know, what can we learn from these different types of researchers we might be. So in this, we have one who is an indigenous ally. We have the critical comrade that's like, how do you work with movements and critique them at the same time, or be, you know, the critical friend of movements. The slow and careful scholar, how do we slow down and take care of ourselves while we try to do this activist work as a scholar. And in the paper, we try to kind of say how, kind of by bringing this also reflexivity about our own roles, we can, you know, achieve political rigor. So as well as the academic rigor, the political rigor is how do we know that we're being fair with the communities we're working with? How do we acknowledge upfront the power asymmetries that we're dealing with? How do we kind of commit to saying we're going to try to eliminate hierarchies or acknowledge them and say we're going to work within them, or what is, so thinking through all these things and making them as explicit as possible, I think, is one way forward to working with communities. I'll let you guys answer about the local researchers. And I think the scales thing, yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of, as I was saying about the atlas, it's a little bit the value of the work in some ways is having this very, very localized case studies. And I guess, I mean, you can even go down to like the level of the individual, of these personal stories of transformation, that the personal transformation is, I think, cannot be discounted. When we look at transformation, we tend to look at what are these big things, but we also want to capture individual stories of what are these moments where individuals are transformed. And I mean, you look at now what's happening in the States and the Green New Deal, and AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, came to her political awakening through participating in Standing Rock, you know? So these personal stories of transformation also become so important as we think about them. And then like the Atlas, which is this super, which, I mean, I get frustration often of like dealing with this super meta global project. And with this really lofty aim in some ways where we say, well, we want to help contribute to the, you know, the environmental justice movement's realization of itself in a global scale. So help the coherence of this global movement. And it's like, seems a bit unrealistic or stuff. Are we contributing to that aim? I'm not, you know, I can't, it's difficult to say, but perhaps to a degree. So I think there's, yeah, the scales definitely move across time.
In relation to transformation and scales, I mean, I think anyone that would be engaged in this kind of research would be personally transformed, like that's for sure. But I think, for instance, what we are trying to do is more transforming the movement and trying to enhance their local agency and try to a bit capacity building. It's more on capacity building, I would say. And the idea is if we can achieve this, it will be easier for them to make transformation at the regional level. And of course, I think if the case we are working with is transformed, then Turkey at the national scale means it will be transformed. So, but what we are trying to do is to work with the movement itself, I would say. And that's how academic activists co-produce knowledge also maybe fits in what we are on what we are doing. And in relation to working with people and publish together, for instance, this is an issue which is again sensitive in the sense that either you work with everyone in the group, or at least for us, because we are a quite like kind of prestigious university, this would create an like kind of imbalance within the movement. That's our feeling. So what we are trying to do is we will try to publish something in Turkish with them, but in a way that they can use in the movement and not as part of with authors. It's something that will be the material for the movement itself. And we did an archival work and we published a book chapter. So the idea is now is to transform it in a manner that they can use at the local level. And that will be like kind of, you know, a product we will work on together, but anonymous, like a product of the movement. Yeah.
Just to say that scales is a big issue for us, and this idea of small conflicts becoming local transformative processes, staying local, is a limited approach to transformations. And for instance, one of the, well, my own research that I also brought has to do with how some strategies and transformations travel in time and space. And as you were mentioning, it's from the individual to the social. For instance, in Latin America, there has been some communities conducting local consultations against mining. In some cases, these consultations succeeded to stop mines. Sometimes they didn't, but the results has been 700,000 people voting against mining, against mines in Latin America until 2012. And so if you see in time and space some of these local transformative processes, you can see the huge transformations they are bringing at national and regional and even global scales. So, but it's a challenge to capture that, because sometimes it's not that easy to see the connections, no? How a local experience is shared among networks and movements, and it inspires other places, other transformative processes. So it's also when you try to see these bottom-up transformations and how they travel and transform in different places in different ways, there's also a methodological challenge of how to see these connections and see this. But this is something we also try to look at.
Oh, sorry, there's just one more thing I forgot to say. When I was mentioning the tarot, I was saying, so that's now been turned into an exercise that you can run. For example, it's an arts-based exercise where we use collage. And in this paper, we describe the exercise, and it's kind of open up for different teachers and students and others to use it. And also the alternatives framework in India, you were asking whether these things are just being kind of kept in a website, but the alternatives framework in India is now being transformed into a sort of interactive game with cards and illustrations that can also be taken to different communities and used by different communities to sort of track their own process. So it was, the initial idea, I think, was that, you know, somebody from outside comes and helps guide you through the process, but it doesn't need to be that way. The idea is also to make these things accessible, and here I think like exploring the role of arts-based approaches opens up a lot of possibilities for these.
Just to wrap up in relation to your question about co-participating as researchers, in the work that I do in Bolivia, but also in other parts with indigenous peoples, I've always worked with indigenous co-researchers. So this project in ACKnowl-EJ, there were two leaders that were part of the research team who actually defined the planning, the capacity building process together with us, and they were facilitators in the process, and they were key in moving the process forward. They also participate as co-authors in chapters of books that we've been writing. And the other thing that we do is we are now doing, as part of the ACKnowl-EJ project, we call a global worldviews dialogue, trying to create a dialogue between the Latin American cases and the Indian cases through videos. So it's not ideal because we want to bring them together physically like we did in India with the Indian partners, but it's expensive. So we've only found funds so far to produce videos that we can actually send to each other, produced by them, to share their worldviews about their struggles and all that. I think that there were some other issues, but I think we have to stop, unfortunately, because it's 3:30 and there's another session now.